Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Webinar Wednesday series. Today, we're going to be talking about printing like a pro using Excel. I have Connor joining me today. He's going to be helping out answering questions from chat. He's recording today's session, and we'll be making sure if there's any questions that are outstanding that we get those answered. So. Again, welcome. My name is Tennille Fincham. I am a technology instructor with KUIT, and as I mentioned, Connor is going to be helping us out today as the co-host of this presentation. A couple of housekeeping things, and then we will get started with today's content. First, I do want to mention again, you may have seen it pop up on your screen, but I do verbally want to say that we are recording today's session. After the presentation, I'll upload the video to our YouTube channel. If you haven't taken a look at our YouTube channel, it's a good resource to see all of the past Webinar Wednesday presentations. We also have additional recorded videos there as well for training. So if you're interested, the web address is youtube.com/KU Technology. And if you want to keep seeing all the new stuff we add, be sure to like our channel. All right, as far as getting set up in Zoom, I have a couple of things that will make using the interface a little bit easier for today's presentation. One is I'm going to ask that unless you're currently asking a question, to keep your microphones muted. It looks like everyone is right now, so we should be good to go. This will just help to cut down on some of the feedback during the session. The second is I am sharing my screen throughout the duration of today's presentation. So if you maximize your screen using the square button in the upper right-hand corner, it will let you see as most of my screen as possible. And then finally, to participate, asking questions, things like that in today's session, there's going to be two panels to use. One is the chat panel. This is where you can ask your questions or see any questions that are rolling in as we're going through the presentation. And then the second panel is the participants panel. This is where you can see both yourself and everyone else in the session today. It's also where you're going to see this nonverbal feedback menu. So during the session today, I'm going to be checking in with you all just to see if we are good to move on a topic, if there's additional questions, if you want me to go slower or faster, just to kind of get the temperature check of the audience to see where we are. So with that, if you could go ahead and open up your participant panel. If you've found that, go ahead and give me a green check mark. Cool. So it looks like most of us have found that, so that's perfect. I'm going to have Connor clear our responses so that they're ready for the next question. All right, so today we're talking about printing in Excel. To get us started, we're going to be talking about the default print settings, kind of what's already set up if you just went to File Print within Excel. We're also going to be talking about the page layout. We'll be talking about the tab and the ribbon, as well as the specific view in Excel. And we'll talk about things like changing the margin size or the orientation. We'll talk about adding in headers and footers or adding in print titles. We'll talk about formatting multiple worksheets at once and lots of other things that we can do within those two page layout options. We are going to be talking about printing cell borders as well as tables, which are ways that you can style your worksheet before you print. And throughout the session, we'll be talking about if you want to print just one worksheet, if you want to print multiple worksheets, if you want to print an entire workbook, or if you want to print just a selection of an individual worksheet. And then finally, we'll talk about printing multiple workbooks as well. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit about the default print settings. So when you open up Excel and you're getting ready to print, so you go to File, Print. These are the default settings. If you change nothing, that will happen. The first is that Excel Print will print only the active worksheet that you're viewing. So it's whatever worksheet you were viewing before you went to File, Print. Next is that the orientation by default will be portrait, which means that you're having a vertical layout. The page size will be set to 8.5 by 11. And your margins will be set to normal, which means that the top and the bottom are 0.75 inches and the left and the right are 0.7 inches. It will have a scaling of none, so it's going to print your file at 100% of the size of your fonts and images and things like that that you have within Excel. There are a couple of other things that I want to mention that happen by default when you print. One is that column titles, so if you have titles across your columns like name, address, price, things like that, they will only be printed on your first page. So that's the default. The other thing that happens by default is that page breaks. If you have multiple pages of content that you're printing, they will be determined by how much data can fit vertically on your page. So we'll talk about that and why sometimes that's not the best default setting, and we'll talk about how to fix that. So those are the default print settings. Like I said, if you change nothing in your file and you go to File, Print. Okay, so let's talk about how we can change those default settings for our file. The first thing that I want to talk about, and I'll show you what this looks like, but the first thing to talk about is the page layout view. So this view lets you add in things like a header and a footer, which will be repeated across all of your pages, just like it is within Word. It's also going to let you see where the page breaks occur. And so for me, it's really easy to see, and that's where I prefer to go to see how things will change as I make adjustments to the settings. That way you don't have to click back and forth between print and your file. You can just see it all in one. So let's take a look at this. I have an Excel file here. I have multiple worksheets, which is going to be important a little bit later in this specific file. Right now, we're in what's called the normal view in Excel. This view does not show the header and footer, so it's hidden in this view. And all we're seeing are the cells of our data where we would enter. This is the default view in Excel and probably what most of you are familiar with working with and viewing within the program. So the view that I'm talking about here resides under the View tab. So View, and then Page Layout. This Page Layout tab, as you can see, we now have items that say Add Header. If I scroll down, we also have the option to add footer. So that's the number one thing that's visible here. The other thing that you can see is where your data will be split across the page breaks. So I can see that if I make no changes to the print settings, I'm going to have a total of 6 pages printed. And if I want everything kind of in one sheet, I'm going to have to do some really fancy folding and taping to get all of these columns across one sheet. Okay, so let's talk about some things that we can change in this page layout view. The first thing to talk about is to show you how to add in some header and footer elements. So in the header and footer, we have 3 different portions. You'll notice those when you hover over Add Header, or again, if I scroll down and hover over Add Footer. There is a center section to add content. There's a rightmost portion, and there's a leftmost portion. And all you need to do to start adding content to the header or footer is to just click on where it says Add Header or Add Footer. This gives you an extra header and footer design tab at the top. So you get another ribbon tool menu at the top. Now, I could type whatever I wanted here. I could type whatever I wanted. And that's going to be repeated across all of the headings. Some better options here, if you want to add in some of the document elements, are here under the header and footer elements. A couple of ones that we recommend are the file title and the date. because sometimes you get these printouts of Excel and it's hard to know what file that really was. So if you add the file title to the header or the footer, it will be easy to go back and find that information in your on your computer. Okay, so I'm going to click into this leftmost section. I'm going to use these header and footer elements. If you're used to working with Word, these are pretty similar. So I'm going to do file name. It's just going to give this at ampersand, and then it's going to say file. I'm going to finish this off here by clicking in the rightmost section, and I'm also going to add in the date. So it's not until I click out of the cell that I've entered the header content that I actually see the actual date or the actual file name. So when you're in that portion of the header or footer, it's going to have things like ampersand date or ampersand file. So it isn't until you click into your data or at least out of that cell in the header that you'll actually see the information from your header. Now, if I scroll over here, you can see that this information is going to be repeated across all of my pages. And if I scroll down, I have my additional header information. In the footer, you could also add something like, in this case, I have multiple printed pages. So I may want to add in page number. So again, in the header footer design tab, I can add in page number. And once I click out of that cell, I have the page numbers repeated for me. So now if things change or if I have less page numbers, I don't have to go back and manually figure that out. Okay, so the page layout tab, again, great for viewing the header and footer or making adjustments to the header and footer if you want to add repeating elements. Also really great for, and where I prefer to see how my page will be split apart. Okay, so I want to take a quick question break here. Questions for me over anything we've covered so far. So we've talked about the default print settings and then going to the View tab and adding in a header. Any questions over that so far? If you are good to move on, if you will just give me a green check mark and then I'll know we can move on. Cool. Great. Okay, so I'm going to have Connor clear those responses. So right up until now, all we've talked about is just adding in this header, but we haven't really addressed the fact that this is printed on 6 pages. And unless I want to do some fancy taping and pretend that this is 1 page, that this information on the columns will be split apart as well. So the next place to go to actually make those print setting changes is under the page layout tab. So let me bring up my slide because I have some information here that I want to talk about. So the page layout tab, this layout tab lets us change things like the margin size or the page size that we're printing on. We can also change the orientation of the page. So do we want it landscape or do we want it portrait? We can also set something called print area, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as the page breaks. You can also add in print titles. This is a big one if you have multiple pages. I mentioned that the default setting is that if you have those column headings like name, IMPL ID, student ID, by default, those are only printed on the first page. This print titles option allows you to tell Excel what rows you want to repeat at the top. So you can have those headings repeated for you and you don't have to do any fancy manual work to get those column headings to repeat. We'll also talk about scaling. And then the last thing to talk about under the page layout tab is the idea of printing those grid lines and then also printing something called headings. I do also want to mention if in this particular document I have multiple worksheets, and this is the pretty similar data that I have in each of them, if I want to make sure that each of these worksheets is printed in the exact same way, you can hold down the Control key on your keyboard and you can select all of the worksheets or just those that you want to have the same print settings. Once you have them all selected, you can make changes to one of them under the Page Layout tab, and it will apply to all of the worksheets that you have selected. So if your data is like mine in this case, and I want it all to be printed in the same way, this helps so you don't have to keep duplicating the work and the effort to get them in all the correct settings and print options. All right, so I have my worksheets selected at the bottom. These are the ones that I want to be printed in a specific way. So the first thing that I would probably do for this particular data set, and every data set is going to be different, but for this particular data set, what I would probably do first is I would change the orientation. Right now we're in portrait, which is the vertical view. I would change this to landscape first of all. So once I do that, you can see I get most of my columns. The only one that is kind of off to the side still is total. So if my goal is to make sure that I have all of these on one printed page, I have a couple of options at this point. Well, really, more than a couple. So again, one option is I could go ahead and print it out, do some fancy folding, and tape it all together. So not a great option, but it would be an option. The second option is that I could change the scale of this file. So right now the scale is at 100%, and this is under Page Layout, Scale to Fit. Here I could say that I want to scale my file so that widthwise, all of my columns fit on one page. So instead of automatic, I could choose one page. That's going to scale down any text or images and my header down, and it's going to fit all the columns on one page. Now, the place to look here is under this scale. So right now, I'm at 94%. That's pretty good, really, for this file. There may not be any very large, noticeable font size changes, but I would caution you when you get down to like 75%, it might start to get pretty hard to read once this file is printed out. So just take a look and keep an eye on that scale. Definitely if you're getting down to something like 30%, it's going to be really hard to read once you print that out, because it means that all of your text is now printed at 30% of the scale, so much smaller. All right, so that is one option, and then I get all of my columns on one page. All right, so I'm going to change this back to automatic, and I'm going to change this back up to 100%. Okay, so option one was to change the scaling. Option two is to change the margin size. Oops, there we go. Is to change the margin size. So right now we're at the normal. Remember that's 75.75 inches for the top and 0.7 for the left and the right. I could change this to narrow, which gives me a much smaller left and right margin. And when I do that, this worksheet just so happens to also fit on one page. So again, these settings are going to be different for every worksheet that you work on. So that's why I want to show you all of these different options. This one, it just so happens that when I change the margins to narrow, this also gives me my intended result of having my total column on the same page as everything else. All right, so that's option two, change the margins to narrow. Okay, so I'm going to put these back at normal. The third option is to change the size of the page. So the size of the page, as I mentioned, by default is 8.5 by 11. Under size here, I have other options for the print size of the paper that I'll be using. So I'm going to search for 11 by 17. So if I know that a couple of things need to happen, I need to have all of the columns on one page, but then I also need to have room for some notes for people to make during the meeting that I'm showing this, or if I'm printing this out for my manager or director to overlook, I may want to have some room on the margin for them to make some notes. So here, if I choose 11 by 17, that gets me all of my columns on one page. And if I scroll over a bit, you can see I also have some blank area on the side here. And so this could be used if needed for notes or things like that. So, again, I keep saying it, but it really does depend on the data that you're using and the final intent of the file. If the intent is to make notes, you may want to make the page size a little bit larger so that there is that opportunity to make notes on the same worksheet. If you don't need that option, then getting away with changing the margins to narrow or changing the scale may work for that particular document. So I'm going to change this back. I'm going to do my size back to the original 8.5 by 11. And I changed my margins back to narrow as well. Okay, so questions for me so far on this page layout tab. All right, so the next default setting that I mentioned was that this row at the top, where I actually have the titles for all of my columns, this is only printed on my first page. So when I scroll down, I don't have those nice column headings across the top. So I would either have to do some cool folding techniques so that I can see the titles at the top, or I'd have to write it on there when I print this out so that I could remember what each of the column represents. Or I have seen some individuals manually figure out which row they would need to add to have those column headings added. The problem with that is if your data changes in any way, if you remove or add data, then you're scrambling to change those column headings manually again to have them at the top. So the better option for that is to use this button under page layout that says print titles. When you select print titles, this is going to open up another page setup window. And there's an option at the top. It says rows to repeat at top. And we also have this option that's columns to repeat at left. So if you can't get all of your columns on one printed piece of paper, this is another good option as well. And I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so the rows that I want to repeat at top are this row number 1. So to get that in there correctly, all I need to do is click into the bar, and I'm not sure why this isn't letting me do it. Let's see here. It's like the curse of the live demo. Okay, so all I would need to do is add in, and let's see if I can get this to work here. All right, well, for some reason, this is not showing up, even though it did earlier today. Maybe I need to deselect these pages here. All right, so let's do print titles. There we go. So it looks like the print titles is one of those options that you can only do worksheet by worksheet. So since I had multiple selected at the bottom, I wasn't able to actually make that change. All right, so one worksheet selected. I then clicked on print titles, and to actually add in and have it format correctly, all you need to do is click into the box next to rows to repeat at top. It has your cursor, it's blinking there, and then you come over to your document and you select the row, so you get that black right-facing arrow. You select the row or rows you want to be repeated. So I'm just going to select row 1. And when I click OK, when I scroll down, you can see on my print preview that row heading is now going to be repeated on all of my printed pages. And if anything changes in the data, it will just automatically update for me. So if I add a new page of information, if I remove a page of information, I don't have to worry about making changes manually. Now, let's say that I had data, let's say my total row, I couldn't get it to fit on this page. So I'm going to put my margins back to normal. Actually, let's change these to wide so we can see it a little bit better. Okay, so let's say, I can't get this stuff to fit on one page horizontally or vertically, so I have some things hanging off on another page. The other thing you might want to change under print titles, so page layout print titles, is the columns to repeat at left so that you have an idea of which department these figures are part of. So again, you click in the box next to columns to repeat at left, come over to your worksheet, and I can select one, I can select multiple. So let's say I want to repeat A through C. I select those. It formats that for me in the way that it needs to. I'll click OK. And now you can see on those pages where we had the number of items in the total, we still get those first three columns that are repeated, so we can see the relevant information that we need to for the department, who the person was or the contact for that department, and what category of spending. So these are huge when it comes to having multiple pages and needing to have and get your bearings on what those columns are actually pointing to. All right, so I'm going to make my margins. I'm going to bring these back to narrow so that we just get one printed page. Okay, so I want to pause there. Questions over adding in those titles for the rows or the columns to be repeated at top? Okay, so if we are good to move on, if you'll just give me a green check mark. Okay, cool, awesome. All right, I'm going to have Connor clear those responses. If you do have questions, feel free to unmute your microphone, or if you don't want your audio recorded, you can always type in the chat if you have any questions. All right, so let's take a look at this in our print preview. So if we go to File, Print, we'll be able to see a lot of the screen like we did previously under our page layout view. But the thing I want to mention here is the idea of those grid lines. So if I go back, in the view here, I see those grid lines between each of the cells. By default, those grid lines are not printed. So when I do a file print, you'll see I don't have those grid lines between each of the cells. There are a few ways that you can style this to have in those grid lines or the borders between the cells. Okay, so let's take a look at that. The first option, if you want every single one of these grid lines printed, is that under page layout, there is the option. It says grid lines. Right now, it's a view. So when I'm viewing the file, I can see the grid lines. I can also check print. So when I do that, when I go to File, Print, all my grid lines are there. So that is option one. To select the grid lines, print, and every single one of those grid lines will be printed. The other option next to grid lines is this headings. The headings are actually the column A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then the row. So if I turn these on to print, then when I go to File, Print, I see A, B, C, D, E, and then also the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So depending on your data, this may or may not be helpful. All right, so let's go back. So I'm going to turn both of these off so we can talk about other options. The other options for changing the way that this is styled is under the Home tab here. And again, These next few that I show you, if you hold down the Control key and select those multiple pages, they will also be formatted in this same way. So one thing I may want to do is I may want to select all of my data, and I may want to do a couple of things. Under the Home tab of the ribbon, I can make changes to the font as well as the cell information. So here, the square of squares, this is the cell borders. So I may want to do a couple of things. I may want to add all borders so that it gives me all the interior and exterior of the cells that I have selected. And then I may also want to do something like just this department column. I want to have outlined in a thick border. So now when I go to File, Print, I have a thick border around that department column, and everything else has a border on the interior and exterior as well. You can also make changes to the cell color. So maybe the only thing I want to change is that this has a dark border and it's also shaded in blue. So again, when I do a file print, you can see the preview of what that will look like. Now, also because I had those multiple worksheets selected, these have those same settings applied. So this is purchase history 2015, this is purchase history 2016, and they have all of those same settings applied. Okay, so that's another option, is to use the style options on the Home tab under this font area to make changes to just very specific cells. If you want, I'm going to undo a couple of my changes here. If you want an even more stylized file, let's say that you want, I'm just going to make sure I got all this stuff off here. If you want to have every other row shaded and you want to have more style for this heading row and for, let's say, the first and last columns, then a really quick way to do that so that you don't have to select every other row and shade them is to format your data as a table. The format data as a table can only be done worksheet by worksheet, so I'd have to select one worksheet at a time and format it as a table. To format your data as a table, you want to make sure that a couple of things are true. One is that you've removed any completely empty rows in your data set, and two is that you've removed any completely empty columns in your data set. Once you've done that, what you'll do is you'll select your data, and I'm using a keyboard shortcut here to select it. I'm using a Shift Control down arrow key, which selects down to the first empty row, and a Shift Control right arrow key, which selects over to the first empty column. So those keyboard shortcuts are what I'm using to select the data in this case. Okay, once I have the data selected, on the Home tab of the ribbon, there is a Format as Table button. So here I can say Format as Table, and there are a lot of other additional style options. For myself, as a general rule, for myself, I usually choose something in the medium category, but you can always make changes once you've selected a style if you want to see the other options. Okay, so I'm going to select this dark blue one here. It's just going to confirm where your data is. And then the other thing that you want to make sure that you keep checked is this My Table has headers, because we do indeed have headers for our column rows. So I'm going to click OK. And it's going to format this into a table. So notice that using that, I get the every other row shaded. It's what's called row banding. And just like we saw when we were adding in our header and footer, When I'm clicked into one of the cells of my data in the table, I get an extra Table Tools Design tab at the top. And so here I can do things like turn banded rows on or off. I can turn on banded columns, which shades every other column. And I can also turn on what's called first column, last column. This is going to be different for each of the styles that you choose. But what these do is it calls more emphasis to the first column and the last column in your data set. So again, it's going to be different depending on the data that you, or the style that you've chosen. This one I think just puts information maybe in bold here. I guess it looks like our total row got shifted over to that next page. So you can see our total row is in this bold color. And if I turn on first column, then this department is in that bold color as well. Okay, so I'm going to make a change here under page layout. I'm already in the narrow margins. I'm going to make this so that I'm just on one page so we can see it a little bit easier. Okay, so questions for me on starting to style these worksheets for printing. Again, if you're using the styles under the Home tab, these options here, when you're changing like cell border or color, you can make changes to multiple worksheets. If you are using the table format, you can only do that one worksheet at a time. Okay. All right, so what we talked about so far is the idea of printing one entire worksheet, which is the default in Excel. When I go to File, Print, it's going to print the active worksheet, which is the worksheet that I'm currently viewing. If I want to print just a selection of these cells, so let's say I don't need everything, I just need maybe the date, let's say the category, the date, over to price, and I just need a portion of this. I don't need everything. There's a couple of ways you can do that. If this is a one-time only print, then you can highlight the cells that you want to print and then go to File, Print. Under Active Sheets, you'll choose Print Selection instead. And that will show you just the selection that you have highlighted in your cells, and that's the only thing that would be printed. This is a one-time only print selection, so it won't always be this that is printed. If you need to always define that this is the part of the worksheet that's printed and nothing else, then you may consider setting up what's called a print area. So the print area is something that you define ahead of time, and then you print based off of that print area that you've defined. It's always what will be printed unless you clear the print area or ignore it when you're printing. So the first thing to do is the same step. You highlight the cells that you want to be printed. Then you'll click on the Page Layout tab. Here under Print Area, you'll select Set Print Area. And when you do that, it's kind of hard to see with this table setup, but it will put like a darker border around your cells here. Maybe let's go to a page where we don't have one set. Okay, so if I just want to print these items here, I'll do Page Layout, Print Area, Set Print Area, and it's kind of hard to see again, but there's like a darker line around that area I defined. Now, when I go to print, if I do a File, Print, right now I'm still in the print selection because of the settings that I had previously. Here, what I'm going to want to do, if I have a print area defined, is to choose Print Active Sheets. And because I have a print area defined on the active sheet, that is the only thing that will be printed. If I'm done using this print area, if I've used it a few times and then we decide that we want to change what the print area is, then you can come back up to print area and choose clear print area. You can also add to if you just need to add some additional rows to the area. If it's a one-time only, I want to ignore this print area, but every other time that's what I want to use to print, you can click on the File tab from the top. We're going to go to Print, and at the bottom there's this option that says Ignore Print Area. So I can select Ignore Print Area, and then I'm back to the full worksheet. So if it's a one-time only that I want to print everything instead of that selection, you can choose to ignore that. And then you'd have to deselect Ignore Print Area to just get back to the print area that you've defined. Okay, questions on print area versus just printing a selection of cells? Okay, let's go back. The last thing that I want to show you here is creating page breaks. So by default, Excel breaks the pages. If I do a file, let's clear this print area. Excel by default breaks the page by the amount of data that can fit vertically on the page. Sometimes this may not be exactly what you want. Sometimes a couple of things will happen. One, it splits it in a weird place and you don't necessarily like where it splits the data. Two, sometimes they'll be on the very last page, just like 3 or 4 rows. And so you may want to change the break so that there's an equal number of rows on each page. To set the specific page breaks, there is an option under View, and it's Page Break Preview. So let me bring up my slide here because it might be a little bit easier to see these dotted lines. Under the Page Break Preview, you'll see a vertical and a horizontal dotted line indicating where those pages are currently broken horizontally and vertically. And you can click on these page break dotted lines to adjust where that page is broken. So let me show you how to do that. In my Excel file, let me zoom in a little bit here. I only have one page break line, which is this horizontal line. If I want this to end after these credit card statements, I can click and drag and move this up to the new page break where I want it to occur. And then I have page 1, and page 2 starts with those P card purchases. And I could do the same thing if I wanted for page 2. I can click and move this up, and now I have a new print page break for page 2. Page 3, here's that situation that I described for page 5 where we only have a few lines on the page that's printed. So I may choose to divide page 4 and 5 in half so that I get equal amounts of printed information. So now when I go to File, Print, you'll see that these don't always necessarily go to the very bottom of the page because I've set that specific page break in this file to occur at a different place. All right. So those are page breaks. We've talked about changing the layout of your page. If you make some of these changes, I made that into a table, so then I had to go back and make some additional changes. That may happen. You may want to start with formatting your worksheet first visually and then go into your print settings to make sure that you don't have to duplicate your efforts again. I do have a few tips here with Excel. We talked about this and I showed you how to do this, but one tip is that if you want to make changes to multiple worksheets at once, hold down the Control key on your keyboard and then select those worksheets. And then you can make your printing or layout changes and they'll apply to all worksheets. If you want to print multiple worksheets at once, so I've made all those changes to all of these worksheets and I want to print all of them, you can hold down the Control key, select the worksheets you want to print, and then go to File, Print, and it will print all of those worksheets. The other tip here is to save your file. So after I've made all of these changes to this Excel workbook, and I have the printing settings in exactly like I like, if you do a file save or click the floppy disk icon at the top, it will also save all of your print settings that you had defined earlier. It works whether you make changes under the page layout tab or whether you make changes under file print. Both of those places, no matter where you make your printing changes, it will save once you've saved your file. Another tip here, if you are preparing this file for someone else, maybe to review or to print at a later date, then an option here is to print this to PDF. So this will give them just kind of a final review of the file. So here in my workbook, let's go to this one. I'm just going to turn on the grid lines here to be printed. So when I do a file print, I have everything set up here, but I don't want to send it to the MFD yet because I want my supervisor or I'm preparing this for a coworker, whatever that may be. Instead of selecting the MFD as the printer type, you can select Adobe PDF and then choose Print. And it will create a PDF file and will retain all of those printing settings that you had defined. So I'm going to click Save. It's going to save my PDF file. Should go ahead and open that up for us here to view. Here's the file. It has all of those settings like the grid lines and all of my options that I had created for my printing file. So all I would need to do now is to send this off to whomever I'm preparing it for, and they could print out the PDF of this. All right, so this is just my final slide, just a mention of the printing recap, how to print one worksheet, parts of a worksheet, multiple worksheets, the entire workbook, and how to make changes to the print settings and the final style. With that, are there any final questions for me over the session? All right. I do want to mention where to go for help. So if you have questions about using Excel or other Microsoft tools, you are welcome to contact our team at ty@ku.edu. If you are having technical difficulties or if you have questions on installing Microsoft Office, you can contact our IT Customer Service Center at itcsc@ku.edu or 785-864-8080. Thank you so much for joining our session, and if you do have any questions, feel free to reply back to my follow-up email.